This is Rummy's Corner. The pride of Wales, Joe Calzaghe, is the featured boxer in this edition of the Top 5 Notable Wins series. So let's jump right in and go through a quick chronology of what I personally consider to be the top 5 notable wins during the undefeated Hall of Fame career of the Italian Dragon, Joe Calzaghe. On October 11th, 1997 at Sheffield Arena in Sheffield, England, Joe Calzaghe squared off against Chris Eubank for the vacant WBO super middleweight title. Calzaghe dropped Eubank with a sneaky left hook in the opening seconds of the fight. Eubank bounced up quickly and the action resumed. Calzaghe's superior speed was serving him well, where he frequently threw punches in bunches. The fight had an awkward rhythm. Both boxers had styles that were a bit unorthodox, and Calzaghe's southpaw stance amplified this dynamic. Over the next few rounds, Eubank was sometimes being effective, but Calzaghe was usually throwing more and often landing better. There was a lot of infighting, and whenever the two became tangled, Calzaghe would fire away whenever he had a free hand. As things progressed through the middle rounds of the contest, it evolved into a rough and scrappy affair. Simply the Best and the Italian Dragon were both frequently engaged in brawling toe-to-toe action. Eubank was landing some sneaky shots, and he was battling better during this stretch where the two fought on fairly even terms. But Calzaghe's superior punch output was giving him the advantage. These patterns remained familiar in the later stages of the fight. In round 10, Calzaghe clipped Eubank on the way in with a short left. Eubank's glove touched the canvas and it was ruled a knockdown. Eubank was visibly fatigued in the last few rounds, and Calzaghe continued consistently outworking Eubank down the final stretch. At the end of 12 rounds of action, the Pride of Wales was awarded a unanimous decision with scores of 118 to 109, 116 to 111, and 118 to 110. With the victory, Joe Calzaghe became the new WBO super middleweight champion. On March 4th, 2006, at the Manchester Arena in Manchester, England, Joe Calzaghe put his WBO super middleweight title on the line in a unification bout with the IBF super middleweight champion, Jeff Left Hook Lacey. It was a battle of undefeated champions. Calzaghe was making the 18th defense of his WBO belt, and Lacey was making the 5th defense of his IBF title. Calzaghe utilized an accurate, speedy jab in the early going, and his quicker hands were providing him with an early advantage. There were two basic trends over the next several rounds. When on the outside, Calzaghe was getting off first and scoring at will. And when on the inside, Calzaghe was expertly outmaneuvering Lacey while exhibiting some solid infighting skills. Even when transitioning between ranges, the Italian Dragon was exceptional. Round after round, Lacey simply had no answers. Calzaghe was using incredible footwork that always enabled him to be better positioned, and this frequently allowed Calzaghe to throw punches in bunches with great accuracy. Calzaghe was fighting intelligently, and Lacey looked as if he was worn down, both mentally and physically. Calzaghe was in complete command of the action due to his well-executed, slippery, swarming style. Near the end of round 11, the referee deducted a point from Joe for holding, but by this point it was irrelevant. Calzaghe dropped Lacey in the 12th and final round. To his credit, Lacey beat the count and survived until the final bell after absorbing quite the beating. At the conclusion of 12 one-sided rounds, the Italian Dragon was awarded a unanimous decision, with two judges having it 119 to 107 and the other judge scoring it 119 to 105. With the victory, Joe Calzaghe was the new unified WBO IBF Super Middleweight World Champion. On November 3rd, 2007 at Millennium Stadium in Cardiff, Wales, Joe Calzaghe squared off against the Viking warrior Mikkel Kessler. This was a super middleweight unification bout between undefeated champions, where Calzaghe's WBO championship was on the line, along with Kessler's unified WBA-WBC championship. The action began with an intense yet measured pace. Calzaghe and Kessler were both looking to get a feel for the range while showing one another mutual respect. During the early rounds, Kessler was more mechanical with his approach, whereas Calzaghe was squirrelier and utilizing more movement. They were each having moments and competing on fairly even terms. This pattern continued into the middle portions of the contest. Calzaghe was generally throwing more and landing more, but Kessler was usually the one landing sharper and harder. It was fiercely competitive, and a lot of fireworks erupted in this highly engaging encounter. But the Pride of Wales began dictating the rhythm by boxing intelligently, often sacrificing power in favor of speed and precision. Calzaghe's shift in tactics began shifting the momentum in his favor, and Kessler began having more difficulty finding a target to throw at. Calzaghe built on this momentum during the later rounds of the fight, where he began increasing his activity and putting more behind his punches. Joe was outworking, out-hustling, and out-finessing Mikkel Kessler. To his credit, Kessler continued trying his best down the final stretch, but he had no answers for Calzaghe's athleticism and versatility. Calzaghe continued dictating the action and fighting effectively. The Viking warrior did have a strong showing in the 12th and final round, but by that point it was too late. At the conclusion of 12 rounds, the Pride of Wales was awarded a unanimous decision, with two judges scoring it 116 to 112, and the other having it 117 to 111. With the victory, Joe Calzaghe had become the new unified WBO, WBA, WBC Super Middleweight World Champion. On April 19, 2008, at the Thomas & Mack Center in Las Vegas, Nevada, Joe Calzaghe moved up to 175 to challenge Ring Magazine light heavyweight champion Bernard the Executioner Hopkins. Both boxers were showing mutual respect at the onset. Early in the opening round, Hopkins walked Joe into a beautiful 1-2 that sent Calzaghe down. He beat the count and was a bit tentative as he was having difficulty discovering his range. This trend continued throughout the early rounds, where Hopkins was landing some sneaky shots and he was dictating the pace. The two would often become intertwined in an inside battle where Hopkins and Calzaghe were scrapping away. Calzaghe began establishing a better rhythm throughout the middle portions of the fight. He was generally throwing more and landing more, whereas Hopkins was usually only throwing one or two at a time. Hopkins was still landing cleaner and more effectively, despite the fact Calzaghe was more aggressive. But the Pride of Wales was still landing more, and he began landing some sharp punches of his own. It was a very scrappy affair with a lot of infighting where Calzaghe and Hopkins were constantly maneuvering. Each man would throw with a free hand whenever they were tied up. The fight had an awkward and interesting flow, where both boxers were continually making subtle adjustments and slight counter-adjustments. In that sense, it produced a unique and intriguing tactical chess match. By the later stages in the contest, Calzaghe was almost always the one taking the initiative, and he continued throwing more and landing more. But Hopkins continued fighting intelligently, and he was exhibiting great defensive aptitude, and he was still landing with some tricky shots. Calzaghe was generally out-hustling Hopkins down the final stretch, but the executioner was still holding his own and finding ways to land effectively. At the conclusion of 12 competitive rounds of action, it was a split decision. One judge scored it 114 to 113 in favor of Bernard Hopkins, overruled by the other two judges who both had it for Calzaghe, 116 to 111 and 115 to 112. Joe Calzaghe was the new Ring Magazine light heavyweight champion. On November 8, 2008, at Madison Square Garden in New York, New York, Joe Calzaghe defended the Ring Magazine light heavyweight crown against former 4-division world champion Roy Jones Jr. Calzaghe took the initiative early as Jones started more defensively minded. Later in the opening round, Roy nailed Calzaghe with a stiff jab and followed it up with a right hand, where his forearm smacked Joe in the head to score a knockdown. Calzaghe beat the count and immediately started trading with Jones. Calzaghe continued being the aggressor in round 2, and he was outworking Roy. At times Jones would land, but he was being very selective with his offense. This trend continued over the next several rounds. The Italian Dragon was beating Jones on sheer raw volume. Even when Calzaghe wasn't throwing, his elusive rhythm left Roy reluctant to unload. Jones was landing some shots here and there, but Calzaghe was consistently throwing and landing many more, and he was in complete command of the flow. Later in the fight, Calzaghe kept pressing with his attacks. Time and time again, the Pride of Wales would pin Roy up against the ropes, and Calzaghe's speed and volume were overwhelming him. And when the action unfolded in the center of the ring, it was the same story. Jones was still trying his best, but he was being thoroughly outworked and outclassed. At the end of 12 one-sided rounds, Calzaghe was awarded a unanimous decision victory, with all 3 judges scoring it 118 to 109. So these were the fights that I consider to be the top 5 notable wins for Joe Calzaghe. With a lot of boxers, narrowing it down to 5 fights can be really tricky, but here in the case of Joe, I absolutely positively believe these are the 5 he is best remembered for in terms of significant victories. So counting down from number 5, the victory against Chris Eubank. This was a big step up in class for Calzaghe, who was originally supposed to face Steve Collins for the WBO belt before Collins retired. Then Eubank would be the replacement opponent for Joe, and they competed for the vacant WBO title. Eubank was at the tail end of his career at this point in time, but he was still an elite-level operator at 168, and Calzaghe put forth a commanding performance. In a lot of ways, this was the victory that officially put Calzaghe on the map. Number 4, his victory against Roy Jones Jr. This was another similar case where Jones was far removed from his prime, where he was a long-reigning pound-for-pound king, but even still, Calzaghe put forth an incredible performance where, after suffering the early knockdown, he simply dominated Jones. It was a strong performance from the Pride of Wales in what ultimately was the final fight during Calzaghe's decorated career. Number 3 for me would be his dominant win against Jeff Left Hook Lacey. This was a unification bout between 2 undefeated super middleweight champions, and many observers not only believed that Lacey would win, but a lot of fans thought he'd make easy work of Calzaghe. Instead, it was a one-sided mismatch in favor of the Italian Dragon. This was a showcase performance for Calzaghe where he was truly firing on all cylinders. Number 2, the win against Mikkel Kessler. This was another unification bout between 2 undefeated super middleweight champions. This was another contest where fans were very evenly divided over who would win. But Calzaghe was the one who rose to the moment, and he put on a terrific display in volume and versatility. Calzaghe ultimately made the correct shift in tactics that enabled him to outclass Kessler for long stretches, particularly later in the fight. Terrific win for Calzaghe with historical significance. This wound up being Calzaghe's final fight at 168, but it was definitely his most notable win at the weight class. And number 1, the victory against Bernard Hopkins. This was easily Calzaghe's best win, and in my eyes, nothing else comes close. This was the one victory where Calzaghe truly proved he was an elite-level operator with an incredible boxing IQ to go along with his speed and athleticism. A lot of fans refer to this one as an ugly fight. And while I can understand why some fans may view it that way, I thought it was nothing short of fascinating. Hopkins was a cagey, crafty, elite-level veteran of the game who knew every trick in the book. He was simply a master of adjustments. Even at 43 years old, Bernard excelled at neutralizing his opponent's strengths and breaking them down. But Calzaghe proved himself in this contest beyond any shadow of a doubt. It was an uncommon blueprint of a tactical chess match, where the two boxers were in a constant battle of maneuvering and making adjustments and counter-adjustments. A truly unique and very competitive battle, and at the end of the night, Calzaghe won by out-adjusting the master of adjustments. So what do you think were the top 5 notable wins for Joe Calzaghe? Please share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed and have a wonderful night. This is Rummy's Corner.